At 4:12 a.m. on August 7, 1944, Major Klaus Reinhardt stepped from his Kubelwagen into the gray dawn mist outside Mortain, adjusting his leather gloves. He'd just ordered artillery on Grid 7 Baker, where American stragglers were reportedly hiding. In the next 8 seconds, he would be dead. Not from artillery, not from infantry, from a man he'd already killed, or thought he had. 600 yards northeast, Victor Ellison lay behind the shattered second-story wall of an old stone mill, not sheltering in it, living in it. He'd been there for 19 hours without relief, without orders, without a platoon. They were all dead, cut down in the pre-dawn ambush that was supposed to wipe out the American salient on Hill 314. The Germans had succeeded, except they'd missed one man. Through the scope of his M1903 Springfield, Ellison watched Reinhardt bark orders to a cluster of junior officers. He recognized the man's silhouette from 6 hours earlier, the same officer who'd walked the line after the massacre, shooting the wounded. Ellison didn't feel hatred. He felt the cold, practical stillness of a Montana winter, the same patience he'd used tracking wolves across 10 miles of snow. He'd learned long ago, predators reveal themselves when they think they've won. The crosshairs settled on the iron cross below Reinhardt's collar. Ellison exhaled halfway, held it, squeezed. The Springfield cracked. Reinhardt crumpled. The first of 38. What happened over the next 72 hours wasn't heroism. It was pest control applied to warfare, the kind of methodical elimination that comes from a life spent protecting livestock, not from any tactical manual. Ellison didn't hunt soldiers. He hunted the wolves in German uniforms, the ones giving orders, the ones who made killing efficient. By the time the 30th Infantry Division broke through on August 10th, the 2nd Panzer Division's command structure had bled out from the top down. Junior officers refused to step into leadership roles. Radio discipline collapsed. Tanks advanced without coordination. All because one sheep rancher from Montana understood something about patience, elevation, and the price of leadership that no panzer commander had considered. This is the story of how 38 confirmed kills stalled a strategic breakthrough, saved an estimated battalion, and created a legend the Army never officially documented. Victor Ellison never received the Medal of Honor for those 3 days. He never wanted one. But when he finally came down from that mill, surrounded by spent brass and enemy insignia, he'd proven something terrifying. One man who refuses to retreat can make an entire army afraid to lead. Victor Ellison learned to kill at age 12, not in France, but in the Bitterroot Valley, where the snow fell silent and wolves hunted in packs of 7.
His father had lost 3 lambs in February of 1929, then 4 more by March. The bank was already circling their 400-acre spread like buzzards over a dying steer, and every dead sheep brought the foreclosure closer. His father handed him the Winchester Model 70 on a morning when the temperature hit 15 below. "You find what killed them," he said. "You make it stop." Ellison tracked the pack for 6 days across terrain that would have broken most grown men. He learned that wolves don't hunt randomly. They scout, they pattern, they exploit weakness. He learned that the alpha always hangs back, letting the younger males test the fences, probe for gaps. And he learned that if you want to stop a massacre, you don't chase the noise, you wait where the noise is going. On the 7th day, he found their den in a collapsed mining shaft 8 miles from the ranch. He didn't shoot the pups, he waited. 17 hours in a snowblind he dug with his hands, his fingers so cold he couldn't feel the trigger. When the alpha returned at dusk, confident and careless, Ellison put 1 round through its chest at 340 yards. The pack scattered and never returned. His father sold the ranch anyway. The bank took it 3 months later for $800 in back taxes. Ellison learned something else that winter. Men in suits killed more families than wolves ever did, and they did it with fountain pens instead of teeth. He never trusted crowds after that. Towns meant noise, noise meant distraction, and distraction got things killed. At 16, he'd take work as a seasonal hand, but he'd sleep in the bunkhouse corner, back to the wall, rifle within reach. Other ranch hands thought he was paranoid. Ellison thought they were prey, pretending to be predators.
The Army tried to train that out of him at Fort Benning. They wanted him to trust the man beside him, to move as a unit, to follow orders without hesitation. He did all of it competently, but never naturally. His drill sergeant said he had the instincts of a sniper, but the attitude of a hermit. They were both right. When the shells started falling on Hill 314 and his platoon dissolved into screaming chaos, Ellison didn't panic. He felt the same familiar clarity he'd felt in that Montana snowblind. The understanding that survival belongs to the patient, and that leadership makes the best target because it believes itself indispensable. The wolves in Mortain wore field gray instead of fur, but they hunted the same way, and Victor Ellison had been killing wolves since he was 12 years old. By noon on August 7th, the Germans had counted 11 dead officers and still hadn't fired a single return shot. SS Colonel Dietrich Voss stood in the command tent outside Mortain, staring at a map that no longer made tactical sense. His battalion commanders were refusing to leave their half-tracks, his company captains were conducting briefings from behind stone walls, and somewhere in the fog-choked hills, someone was systematically decapitating his entire chain of command. Voss was a professional. He'd coordinated panzer movements across the Eastern Front, orchestrated the suppression of partisan networks in Poland, and executed scorched earth retreats that left nothing for the enemy but ash. He understood warfare as a system of probabilities and acceptable losses. What he didn't understand was how one man with one rifle could create this level of paralysis. His intelligence officer suggested the Americans had deployed a sniper team. Voss dismissed it. Teams created patterns, and patterns could be predicted. This was something else, something patient and surgical that felt less like military doctrine and more like extermination. At 1:47 p.m., a young Hauptmann named Dietrich was shot through the throat while smoking a cigarette 50 meters behind the front line. The bullet had come from the northeast, from a range the spotters estimated at over 600 yards. Voss walked to the spot where Dietrich had fallen, studied the angle, traced the probable trajectory. His eyes settled on the village of Sam Barthélemy, a cluster of 40 stone buildings clinging to the hillside like barnacles. He gave the order at 2:15 p.m. Every building, every cellar, every attic. If they found weapons, burn it. If they found able-bodied men, assume they were spotters. If the villagers resisted, make examples. Voss didn't care about winning hearts and minds. He cared about removing the terrain that gave the Phantom his advantage. The second company moved through Sam Barthélemy like a plague. They dragged families into the streets, lined up the men against church walls, demanded answers no one could give. An old woman insisted the Americans had all retreated. A shopkeeper swore he'd seen nothing. Voss had them both shot for wasting his time. By 4 p.m., 3 homes were burning. By 5:30, the entire village was rubble and smoke. From his position in the stone mill 800 yards north, Victor Ellison watched through his scope as German soldiers torched a bakery. He watched a mother clutching 2 children, screaming at an officer who didn't speak French. He watched Voss himself walk the streets with the casual authority of a man who believed terror was a tool like any other. Ellison adjusted his scope, calculated the wind, and put his crosshairs on the SS Death's Head insignia below Voss's cap. Not yet. Voss was surrounded by too many men, too many angles. But Ellison made a promise to himself in that moment. The colonel would be the last kill, and it would be personal. Comment, "I stand against tyranny," if you think Colonel Voss's tactics are pure evil. If you side with the oppressor, keep your silence. By 3 a.m. on August 8th, Victor Ellison had been awake for 42 hours. His hands trembled when he tried to load rounds into the Springfield's magazine. Twice he caught himself aiming at shadows that weren't there, a German patrol that dissolved into morning fog, an officer who turned out to be a fence post wrapped in canvas. The stone mill had become a fever dream. Every creak of settling timber sounded like bootsteps. The smell of his own sweat mixed with cordite and stone dust until he couldn't tell what was real anymore. He'd finished his canteen at midnight, and now his tongue felt like burlap. When he blinked, he saw his father standing in the corner of the room, holding that Winchester Model 70, saying nothing. At 6:47 a.m., Ellison spotted movement in a church bell tower 400 yards south, a glint of glass, a rifle scope catching the dawn light. The Germans had finally sent a counter-sniper, and the man was good. He chose an elevated terrain with overlapping sight lines and hadn't moved in 20 minutes. Ellison's vision blurred. He rubbed his eyes, forced himself to think through the exhaustion. He couldn't relocate. The mill was the only position that covered the German approach routes. If he abandoned it, officers would move freely again, and the killing would start over. But if he stayed, the counter-sniper would eventually track his muzzle flash. He needed the German to shoot first and miss. Ellison pulled off his helmet, wedged it onto his rifle's cleaning rod, and slowly raised it above the windsill. Nothing. He adjusted the angle, made it look like a man peeking around cover. Still nothing. The German was patient, waiting for a better shot. Ellison moved the helmet again, this time tilting it as if checking the sight lines. The counter-sniper fired. The helmet spun off the rod and clattered across the floor, a clean hole punched through the crown. Ellison had already pivoted left, scope up, breathing controlled. He found the muzzle smoke in the bell tower, tracked down 6 inches to where the rifle barrel protruded, then another 12 inches to where a man's face would be. He fired once. The figure in the tower jerked backward and disappeared. Ellison collapsed against the wall, shaking. His father was gone. The mill was just a mill again. And somewhere in the German lines, an officer was about to step into the open, believing the American sniper was finally dead.
By midday on August 8th, Victor Ellison had stopped hunting majors and captains. He'd learned something watching the German lines through his scope for 36 hours. The real nervous system of an army wasn't the officers barking orders. It was the radio man carrying the orders, and the junior lieutenant stupid enough to believe them. At 1:23 p.m., he put a round through a radio man's chest at 520 yards. The man had been crouched behind a half-track, antenna extended, relaying coordinates. The Germans didn't even know he'd been hit for 10 minutes. When they finally found him, the radio was destroyed, and the frequency codes were soaked in blood. Ellison worked methodically. He'd identified 7 radio positions in the German defensive network by watching where runners congregated and where officers shouted toward. Over the next 4 hours, he killed 5 more radio men. Not the officers talking into the handsets, the enlisted men carrying the equipment, the ones who didn't rate bodyguards or armored cover. Without radios, the German battalion commanders couldn't coordinate. They sent runners. Ellison killed the runners. They used signal flags. Ellison killed the signalers. By 5 p.m., entire companies were operating in isolation, cut off from division headquarters 3 miles west. Then he started on the young ones, the freshly minted lieutenants with clean uniforms who still believed war was something you could win by following doctrine. They were easy to spot. They carried maps, they pointed at terrain features, and they stood in the open because no one had taught them that leadership made you a target. At 6:14 p.m., Ellison killed a lieutenant giving orders to a mortar team. At 6:52, another one trying to reorganize a machine gun position. At 7:30, a third who'd stepped out of a farmhouse to light a cigarette. The German NCOs noticed. By nightfall, sergeants were refusing direct orders to advance. Corporals wouldn't step into leadership roles when their officers fell. Squad leaders conducted briefings from behind stone walls, whispering instead of shouting, because volume meant visibility, and visibility meant death. Colonel Voss screamed at his remaining company commanders that evening, demanding they restore order and discipline. But discipline requires a functioning chain of command, and Ellison had spent 2 days severing every link in that chain, 1 bullet at a time. The 2nd Panzer Division's advance stalled not because they lacked men or ammunition, but because no one was willing to be the next person in charge. Hit subscribe if you value the truth over the lies of manipulators like the German High Command. Trolls and liars won't click that button.
At 2:37 a.m. on August 9th, Victor Ellison heard boots on stone below him. He'd been reloading his Springfield in near-total darkness when the sound froze his hands mid-motion. 4 sets of footsteps, careful and deliberate, entering through the mill's collapsed southern wall. A German patrol sweeping buildings. They'd finally decided to search everything within 800 yards of their command post, and the stone mill had made the list. Ellison set the rifle down without a sound. Firing would give away his position to every German within half a mile. The muzzle flash would light up the second floor like a flare. He'd killed 27 officers over 2 days, and all of it would mean nothing if they found his nest. He pulled the combat knife from his belt, a 5-inch blade he'd sharpened on a whetstone 3 nights before the battle. His hands had stopped shaking hours ago. The fever dream exhaustion had burned away into something colder and more focused. The Germans were speaking in low voices, sweeping the ground floor with flashlights. One of them laughed at something. Another kicked through debris. They weren't expecting contact. This was a routine check, the kind of patrol that got assigned to men too green or too tired to matter. Ellison sent to the stairwell, staying in the shadows where collapsed timber blocked the light. He could see their helmet silhouettes moving below. One man separated from the group, stepping toward the stone stairs that led up to the second floor. He was carrying his rifle casually, barrel pointed at the ground. Ellison waited until the soldier's boot hit the 3rd step. Then he came down like a wolf on a stray lamb, one hand over the mouth, the blade punched up under the ribcage at an angle his father had taught him for gutting elk. The German made a wet, choking sound and went limp. Ellison lowered the body without sound and took the dead man's rifle. The other 3 were still sweeping the ground floor, calling softly for their missing companion. One came to the base of the stairs. Ellison shot him point blank with the German Kar 98K, then rushed the other 2 before they could raise their weapons. 7 minutes later, the mill was silent again. 4 German bodies lay in the darkness below. Ellison dragged them behind rubble where they wouldn't be visible from the road, then climbed back to his position and resumed loading his Springfield. His hands were steady. The wolves had come to his den, and the wolves had lost. At 11:42 a.m. on August 10th, Colonel Dietrich Voss made his fatal mistake. He stepped into the open. Victor Ellison had been watching the German command post for 3 hours through his scope, waiting for this moment. He'd killed 37 officers over 72 hours, and every single one had brought him closer to the man who'd burned St. Barthélemy, who'd executed civilians for the crime of existing near an American sniper.
Voss emerged from a sandbagged bunker 700 yards southwest, flanked by 2 adjutants and a radio man. He was gesturing toward Hill 314, pointing at terrain features, reorganizing what remained of his shattered command structure. The 30th Infantry Division was preparing a breakthrough, and Voss was making a final attempt to consolidate his defenses before the American armor arrived. Ellison checked his ammunition. 1 round left in the Springfield's internal magazine. He'd been rationing since yesterday, taking only shots that mattered, passing on targets that were merely convenient. He'd known it would come to this. 1 bullet, 1 chance, 1 man who'd ordered the murder of families because warfare was cleaner when you terrorized the innocent. The wind was gusting northeast at 12 miles per hour. At 700 yards, that meant a holdover of nearly 2 feet. Ellison had made longer shots in Montana during elk season, but never with this much at stake. If he missed, Voss would disappear into the bunker and wouldn't emerge again. If he missed, the village would remain unavenged. He steadied his breathing. His father appeared beside him one last time, not speaking, just watching. Ellison wondered if ghosts could approve of killing, then decided it didn't matter. Some men needed to die so that others could stop dying. Voss turned profile, presenting a smaller target. One of the adjutants handed him a map. The radio man was speaking into a handset.
Ellison aimed 2 feet left of center mass to account for the wind, settled the crosshairs on the death's head insignia below Voss's collar, and exhaled halfway. The Springfield cracked one final time. Voss crumpled. The adjutants dove for cover. The radio man dropped his handset and ran. Ellison set the rifle down and closed his eyes. 38. The wolves were leaderless now. The sheep could graze in peace. If you can't stand people who profit from the suffering of others, comment "Justice for the fallen." Only those who lack a soul will ignore this. The 30th Infantry Division reached the stone mill at 4:17 p.m. on August 10th, advancing through German positions that had collapsed without coordinated resistance. Sergeants reported entire companies retreating in disorder. Tank crews found abandoned half-tracks with engines still running. The 2nd Panzer Division had disintegrated not from overwhelming force, but from systemic failure of command. Lieutenant Marcus Webb led the patrol that entered the mill. He expected to find German holdouts or American bodies. What he found was Victor Ellison sitting against a bullet-pocked wall, his Springfield resting across his lap, surrounded by a perfect circle of spent brass casings that glinted like copper coins in the afternoon light. Ellison didn't look up when they entered. His eyes were fixed on something arranged on the floor in front of him, a pile of German officer caps, Feldmützen and Schiermützen stacked carefully like a cairn marking a grave. 38 of them. Webb counted twice to be sure.
The private's uniform was crusted with dried blood that wasn't his own. His hands were black with powder residue. He smelled like cordite and 3 days of fear sweat. And when Webb asked if he was injured, Ellison just shook his head slowly, like a man waking from a dream he couldn't quite escape. Webb's radio man called for a medic. Another soldier found the 4 German bodies on the ground floor, throat cut and knife work clean. A sergeant discovered Ellison's logbook wedged between 2 stones, a sheep herder's tally of kills marked with dates, times, ranges, and estimated ranks based on insignia. 38 entries, each one confirmed by a cap collected under cover of darkness when the Germans weren't watching their dead. They tried to help Ellison to his feet. He pushed them away, gently but firmly, and stood on his own. He left the Springfield where it lay, but gathered the caps into a canvas bag he'd fashioned from a torn German greatcoat. Webb asked what he planned to do with them. "Send them home," Ellison said. His voice was hoarse from 3 days without speaking. "Families should know their sons died leading. Better than what they deserved, but it's the truth." He walked out of the mill into the sunlight, squinting like a man who'd forgotten what daylight looked like. Behind him, the brass casings caught the light, a golden memorial to 72 hours when one sheep rancher had culled an entire pack of wolves. Victor Ellison returned to Montana in November 1945, 3 months after the war ended. The Army had processed his discharge at Fort Dix, handed him a duffel bag with a Silver Star citation inside, and put him on a westbound train with 200 other men who'd stopped talking about what they'd seen. He read the citation once. It mentioned exceptional valor and devotion to duty and 35 confirmed enemy kills. They'd gotten the number wrong. Ellison folded the paper, placed it on the empty seat beside him, and watched the Midwest roll past his window. When he changed trains in Chicago, he left the citation where it sat. Some porter would find it, maybe frame it, maybe throw it away. Either way was fine. The Bitterroot Valley looked exactly as he'd left it 6 years earlier, except the ranch his father had lost was now owned by a family from California who'd made money in defense contracts. They'd painted the barn red and installed electric fencing. Ellison didn't stop to introduce himself. He bought 80 acres on the eastern slope with his military pay, cheap land nobody wanted because the soil was rocky and the winter wind came down like a hammer. He built a 1-room cabin, bought 40 sheep at auction, and went back to the work he understood, watching for predators, tracking wolves, protecting what was his. People in town knew he'd been a sniper.
Word had spread the way it does in small places where everyone knows everyone's business. They'd ask him about France, about the killing, about whether it felt different shooting a man instead of an animal. Ellison would finish his coffee, pay his tab, and leave without answering. He never married, never sought company. On clear days, he'd sit on his porch with that old Winchester Model 70, the one his father had given him, and watch the ridgeline for movement. Sometimes he'd see his platoon in the tree line, Richards and Kowalski and Murphy, the boys who died in the pre-dawn ambush at Murtaine. They never spoke, just stood there watching him the way his father had watched him in the stone mill. Ellison figured that was fair. He'd survived by becoming something that wasn't quite human anymore, a man who knew exactly what a life was worth at 600 yards, who'd proven that one wolf could scatter an entire pack if he was patient enough and cold enough and willing to stand his ground when everyone else ran. He died in 1987, alone in that cabin, his rifle within reach. They found 38 German officer caps in a trunk under his bed, each one tagged with a date and a distance. No one knew what to do with them, so they buried them with him. Some men leave behind legacies written in medals and monuments. Victor Ellison left behind a lesson carved in bone. Predators fear the prey that refuses to run. If you believe in the quiet power of the underdog, hit subscribe. If you're the kind of person who cheers for the villain, you probably won't.